Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's masterclass from Tech Talk to Board Talk. I would also like to welcome our speakers, Peter Christodoulo, who is a partner at Francisco Partners and also sits on Drawbridge's board, as well as our own Simon Eyre, our Chief Security Officer, who will be replacing Jordan Messing as he's recovering. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and we will try our best to answer them during the last 10 minutes of our masterclass. Thank you, everyone. And Simon, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Tina, and thanks for the introduction there. My name's Simon Eyre. I'm the CISO for Drawbridge. I've been with Drawbridge for just over 4 years now. My career spans just over 20 years working cyber and technology in the alternative investment space. As Tina mentioned, I'm standing in for Jordan today. We'll take it from the technologist's perspective on this discussion. I'm very happy to say that I'm joined by Peter today from Francisco Partners. Peter, please go ahead and get the chance to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Simon. I really appreciate it. I'm Peter Christodoulo. I'm a partner with Francisco Partners, a tech private equity investment fund. I've been with FP for 16 years. Spent time in our London office for 5 years and now 11 years in San Francisco. I sit on the board of Drawbridge, and I lead our fintech investing efforts more broadly. So we do a lot in payments, we do a lot in financial software, a lot into the alternative asset and investment management sectors, which is kind of how we got to Drawbridge. Very excited to be here.
Great, thank you. And the topic for today is how to handle that cyber discussion from internal teams, which very often have a technical background and really be able to speak the language of the board. And so Peter can give us really some fantastic insight on how he approaches and how those that approach him in their discussions around cyber. So perhaps, Peter, we could start hearing out a little bit more about your role at Francisco Partners and specifically the experience and depth that you have in working with boards and investment committees.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently on six of our portfolio company boards. I've probably been on something like 20 of our company boards in total, sometimes for short stints, sometimes for longer stints, perhaps a few times as an observer, depending on the circumstance, but certainly been on a lot of our boards. I would also say that, in addition to a big financial technology investing practice, we also have a big just straight up security investing practice at Francisco Partners. And so our investment in Drawbridge was a little bit from our fintech vertical and a little bit from our security vertical. But it's my job to advocate for new investments and take those investments to our investment committee. It's also my job to manage existing portfolio companies and from the time we invest through to whenever we sell our stake. And I'd say our funds, we raise money in our funds from a variety of sources. A lot of them are public pensions, university endowments. We have sovereign wealth funds. We have different corporate pensions, but we're really entrusted with these monies. We have a responsibility to invest it not just into deals we think are good, but into companies we think are doing things the right way, not cutting corners, hopefully not be on the front page of a newspaper for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads quite nicely into my sort of second thought and question for you is obviously a new investment and how boards would approach this. They historically would have thought about financial risks that the business may face, sort of industry changes, perspectives like that, what the growth opportunities are there. But now you have this cyber security and information security risk that you have to weigh up. How do you prioritize the importance of various things like reputation on financial risk and cyber risk? Does that change the concerns for firms and investors now?
Absolutely. I'd say when I started at Francisco 16 years ago, or even in finance 20 something years ago, some of those attitudes were a little bit different. Perhaps it was more about the financial risk, a little bit less. It's like, oh, like if someone targets us, then, and we get unlucky, kind of thing. But these risks are omnipresent, and our reputation, we're not a small little, startup fund anymore. We have a series of funds. We have a lot of people working at Francisco Partners. A lot of people invested in our various funds. And there's that responsibility, I think, as you become, bigger and more high profile, like certainly goes with it. I mean, certainly, if some small startup VC fund had some issues in this cyber area, yeah, it would be it would be a problem. But if it were a fund that you knew or you know the name of, I think that could be a lot more, or say had public vehicles or lots of various publicly reported investors and things like that. It becomes a much bigger issue. So we not just our, I'd say not just our cyber and risk, but also we have ESG considerations. We there are sectors that we won't invest in, or companies. We have a whole ESG committee and process around does this company does this company fit in our investment profile? Like, it could be the best company in the world, but if it's doing some of its business in certain areas or in certain geographies or whatnot, like we may say we just can't invest in it, and that's okay.
I think it's interesting the way that you describe that as a very proactive approach, including things like cybersecurity and ESG, sort of these new but very potentially high priority, high profile risks within businesses. In my experience, I find that that's not necessarily always the case, and sometimes clients that we're working with who need to discuss this with the board, perhaps making an investment into cybersecurity can be a real challenge for them to approach the board, and discussing it in ways of reputational risk and financial risk can be one of those approaches that really helps them almost speak the language of the board in some ways. You're trying to compare it to the typical language that's used in a boardroom, and I think financial and reputational risks are one of the ways, right? Do you say?
Absolutely. And I maybe I'll make it a little more vivid. Like, when I started at FP, we used to have, in our every investment deck, we have a scorecard, and we used to have one scorecard. Now we have 3 scorecards. This is when we're looking to make an investment. It used to be we called it a business quality scorecard. So it would like take all the attributes of a business and try to give it a score as to how high quality a business is, how fast it's growing, how its gross margins, is it profitable, are the customers happy, does it market share, like all these things that go into the quality of a business. Well, now we have a cyber scorecard as our second scorecard,
Okay.
and we also have an ESG scorecard. And you can, like, companies can get dinged and taken out of our investment process for not just business quality and valuation reasons, which would be like all the historical reasons, but like if we think the company's creating an exposure for us on the cyber side or on the ESG side, like that's a big part of our investment committee discussion.
Yeah. So, I mean, this sort of goes to proof in some ways. We talk about what are the influences for Drawbridge clients, the hedge funds, the PE space. Why are they brought into looking at cyber programs? And very often we focus on regulators, but it is true that the investors and allocators of the world are also building this cyber proactive approach to their potential investments. Great. So with the onboarding of a potential new portfolio company, obviously cyber is not a one-time point, single point investigation. You want to ensure that that program continues on. How does a firm like Francisco continue to assess the maturity of a cyber program in its investments and really keep the finger on the pulse of what they're doing?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd say our approach, as I've said on other points here, has evolved a lot over time as the risk environment's changed. But I'd say one thing is, as we go into an investment, we do an initial cyber assessment, and we sort of take a look at we have a cyber team, we have on staff, we assess the company's posture, and then the company, every board meeting has to have a slide in its slide deck or in its board deck that gives its own view as to where it is in terms of, because we'll say, hey, you're good on these 10 things, but on these 6 or 8 things, you're not where we want you to be. And so they have to provide their own readout. And then once a quarter, we at FP go in and our team does a sort of a verification of that. So we at FP, certainly at every board meeting, we see a scorecard, and we can see it compared to the previous scorecard, and we see how things have changed. We see how things have changed, for positive or for negative, hopefully moving in the right direction in terms of closing gaps and things. But then also an email goes out around our whole firm from our cyber team, where every single company in our whole portfolio is benchmarked. as well,
Right.
and see the progress. And if your companies are sort of yellow or red or something instead of green, you're made aware of that very, very publicly. So.
Right. Right. A little bit of peer pressure there in the port case. I
Well,
like
yeah,
it.
I mean, it's a really big deal. I mean, like,
Yeah.
we can do more, but it's not, this isn't optional, you know.
Right. Right. I suppose on a side there, for some companies though, they may not have that proactive approach from their parent companies, or even in a hedge level, trying to sell cyber into the C-suite and the board. It can be much more of a challenge to convince them that they need to include that element in board presentations, doing quarterly meetings, and the like. And did you experience anything like that as Francisco grew and thought, this is something that cyber is a component that we need to do? Was there a way that the business introduced that to the whole team, to all the partners?
It wasn't like one moment, but I'd say over the
Yeah.
last 15 years, it went from everybody kind of doing their own thing, making their own judgments. I might be more pro cyber, and one of my partners might think of it's less of a big deal. So we kind of be doing our own thing, and we've really programmatized and standardized and benchmarked it in a way that is
Right.
now, it's not optional, and it's not my opinion versus my partner's opinion. It's like, this is how we're doing it across the portfolio, and you kind of have to just be on board with that. The I'd say we have had at times, we've had some companies get hacked. Okay, I mean,
All right.
it's a reality. We
Yep.
have about 60
Yep.
portfolio companies at any given moment. We've invested in a couple hundred companies in terms of platform investments in all of our history. And yes, a handful have been hacked at different times, and we have had such situations where people at some of those companies had a looser view of what this should all be, or said, oh, well, why would state actors ever want to target, a fill in the blank company, that has nothing to do with national security or this or that. And but it happens.
Yep.
And it's the sort of thing where, like, we have had a handful of companies get hacked. It's always painful. We do have a SWAT team that comes in, and we've now had it happen enough times, and we have a posture there that's like, we know exactly, we kind of know exactly how to deal with it. But it's never fun, and it causes business damage to the business. It causes damage to customers. You lose some credibility. Yeah, it's just generally not good. But it's kind of like a force majeure event in some ways that, like, probably won't happen. But if it does, you're in kind of trouble. So I mean, it's the sort of thing like buying insurance. Having your cyber posture be strong, and having it benchmarked and followed, and have it taking that really seriously. It's the sort of thing where you can sleep well at night and know that you have a good posture, because in the unlikely event, and it is unlikely, it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it can create a massive business disruption, and
Yeah.
destruction of financial value.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's interesting that, I mean, as you say, cyber attacks are agnostic to size, publicity, the function of the firm. There are specific targeted attacks in certain industries, obviously, whether you have the sort of hacktivist attempts going on, but the vast majority are still opportunistic attacks that we see. And it's very easy to find examples of similar firms to you that have gone through those experiences and had a breach, and the impact it's had on those businesses. And sometimes scenarios are the easiest way to get your message across, and show real world examples of how that's happened to other firms. In terms of the examples you've given there, do you have anything that you've seen sort of that have been real significant failings that have highlighted perhaps then a message out across the broader portfolio? Anything in particular, or the management of large industry technical cyber issues that may happen? Is there anything that you do there to sort of try to help your firms and funds?
It's a good question. I don't think I have a perfect answer for that. I would
Mm.
say it's pretty binary. Like, either you're, publicly being reported as like having a
Yeah.
hack, and and having a problem, and there's lots of companies that happen all the time. And then it's a huge problem. But if it's
Yep.
a lot of times, things are just fine. And but part of what we would say is the reason things are just fine most of the time is because we have a a strong cyber posture, and we're constantly
Absolutely.
evaluating it,
Yeah.
and we're constantly looking at it, and we're spending money on it. It's not it's not optional. It's not optional at what level. It's like, here's your score. Like, you need to close these gaps, and we need to make sure that your posture is better, and constantly getting better, and constantly continually being evaluated. And the reality is, as companies and firms and everyone, you raise additional funds, you invest in companies that do well. The more well-known you are, the more of a target you become. And it's one of these things where you never know when it's going to happen, and you can never be, I mean, it's like you're shock loaded into whatever it could be denial of service attack, could be other things, could be hacks. But when you're if you're an investment firm, and we have LPs all around the world, all sorts of, we have a lot of sensitive information inside our servers. We have material non-public information on companies. We're looking at public companies, all sorts of things. We've got to have security. It's got to be the highest level. It just does. And our investors want to know that. And our companies downstream, we're making them know it, every day, every quarter. Like, if they're out of compliance, or we don't think they're taking it seriously, like, they don't get a casual phone call once a year. It's like, we are right at them on it. So,
For those that perhaps don't have that quite the same sort of pressure, I mean, do you think there's any advice that you could give clients about how they can be more effective engaging their board around cyber? So, like I say, not everybody has necessarily that approach that Francisco does to really be proactive. So, is there something that whether it's a fund or a portfolio company can do to encourage more opportunity to do and develop their cyber program?
yeah, what I would say is, you can't really manage it unless you can measure it. And so every company's different, every situation's different. I'm not going to pretend to know all the situations, but, like, I would just say, try to, evaluate how you think you're doing. Create your own scorecard. Say, how, we think we're good on these 3 things, but we think we're not as good on these 10 things. Hire somebody externally to look at it. It doesn't have to be Drawbridge. There's all sorts of folks out there that can give you an assessment. Lots of folks that can, try to hack into my system, see if you can, like, I just say you got to do it. And in terms of reporting to the board, I think a board that doesn't hear about cyber, might not say anything until there's a problem,
Yes,
or
exactly.
until someone asks the question. And then the management team will often not be viewed particularly favorably if they don't have, an answer to hand, and so I think getting a scorecard, proactively evaluating yourselves and trying to report that out to the board, and saying, hey, even saying, like, look, we may need more resources we may need to spend a little more money to close these gaps. Like, do you like put it on the board, make them decide, they don't want to spend the money, then they can take the risk with you, but the management team shouldn't go naked on it, and they shouldn't be making their own judgment on it. And I don't want to say shouldn't be, but, like, the board should be part of that. It's a critical area.
Yeah. One interesting thing that we have noticed in the sort of more targeted persistent attacks has been a bit of a trend with new portfolio companies coming into the fold of a parent company, and immediately that seems to be a target. Obviously there are press releases, there are changes in the public eye when a company goes through an acquisition. Or an injection of funds. This usually comes with the announcements, and there is truth to a trend that those then become cash rich, but not necessarily cyber skilled yet. They haven't gone through that, and so that's certainly for us. We've witnessed that as a high risk period of time where cyber needs to take some priority. And so I think for any CTO, head of IT, COO that sort of wears the MSP IT, your outsourced IT provider's hat or something like that for the business, really needs to take a serious focus at that point around cyber. So even if it's not a company like Francisco that's putting the pressure down, they need to think of putting that pressure up and beyond. I will point.
By the way,
Yep,
totally agree. And this is why we do a cyber assessment before we invest in something.
right.
Because what's going to happen is we're going to sign an agreement to invest in a company. Then there's going to be a press release before, sort of at the moment we take ownership, or even before we take ownership.
Yep.
And we're not going to be able to have implemented, all of our cyber programs by that point. So they have to have a minimum level of cyber protection. Because, like, when a press release hits and the company's, there's some there's some press around a company, or there's some focus around it. Yes, you're right. The risks are higher for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Just also want to point out, if anybody has a question, please do put it in the Q&A. We will be wrapping up with the last sort of little final points here. We've had a couple of questions come in, so I will get to them. Just Peter, in terms of sort of structure of what we wanted to talk about today, any other specific points that you'd like to get across, just in the workings of fund and tech talking to the board?
Well, I would just say, I think, I've said it before, but I'd probably just say this is the sort of category where you only regret not doing things. You don't regret doing things. You might be fine if you kind of wing it in security. You might be fine. You might survive running through the fireworks factory with a lit match, and you might get through it. It might be okay, but it might not be. And, it can be catastrophic depending on what the circumstances are. So it just doesn't seem in today's world, and maybe the views on that have changed in the last 10, 15 years, as the risks have become more omnipresent and more persistent, to your point. But it just doesn't seem like the sort of thing anyone should be messing around with or winging or taking lightly. It just, the risks just outweigh the benefits massively. So you save a little bit of money, you save a little bit of time and focus, but if you don't do it right and you have a problem, like your business goes down, like you're gonna be spending a lot more time and money thereafter, like 100x more. So
Yeah, I think sort of in terms of final thoughts before we run through just a few of the questions that have come in here. I often see two red flags that concern me, sort of on the just below board level, and then its approach to talk to the board. If they suggest that they have best of breed technology and it's not going to happen to them, or they are too small to be noticed on the internet and therefore they won't be attacked. Two red flags that there needs to be a mental change there in their posture, and breaking through those barriers so that then they are fully informed of the risks to their business and the potential damage that any attack can have. Only then can that sort of exec level be able to talk to a board and really make a push towards understanding that cyber is part of their experience. We talk about it from a top-down level. That's where cyber needs to start. So you need to be able to bring these examples, bring this foundation of cyber risk and relatable to financial risk and reputational risk to really convince people above you that this is something that is real and needs to be dealt with. We've had a couple of questions come in. The first one, the question is, would you share your standardized benchmark scorecard? I'm going to assume that is very much proprietary to you, but perhaps I can think of a couple of examples of industry standard, services. We think a Drawbridge, for example, a lot of what we base ourselves on is the NIST cybersecurity framework, but there are others like the CIS score system, which it does get used quite a lot as well. Anything there, Peter, that you would sort of add as to where people may be able to go if they're really just starting out to understand how to deal with benchmarking scorecards?
yeah, I mean, the first, yeah, no, I can't give the Francisco scorecard out, unfortunately. I'm sorry. It's hard to generalize because every company is different. I don't know if we're talking about a financial firm, we're talking about an operating company, we're talking about a security company on itself, or there's lots of different, a multinational company, a single geography company, a big company, a small company. There's all sorts of considerations there. I would just say you got to try to measure it and find whatever benchmarks you can. Even I'd say industry groups, at Francisco Partners, some of our operating team, they talk to the operating teams at some of our peer firms, some of our competitors, and they want to hear, oh, how are you handling that? How, so I think, trying to figure out who your peers are and what they're doing, the most comparable companies or firms or whatever it is to you and what they're doing. I think creating, people, you can be competitive with another firm, but you can also, on points like this, there can be some shared values and a willingness to kind of cooperate that could be very helpful. We found that in a bunch of places, and so I think to some extent that's what Drawbridge is trying to do with a bunch of its initiatives. It would be unfair to compare the security posture of, say, Blackstone with the security posture of a startup private equity fund just raised its first 100 million. Just not unfair comparison. So let's not make that comparison. Let's compare Blackstone to its peer funds, and let's compare the $100 million startup fund to its peer fund. So I think that's the way I would think about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Another question that's come in, what are your top 3 security postures you demand from a company? I don't know if you have any thoughts there of the initial expectation when you first start talking to a firm about their cyber, program. Perhaps not necessarily what are the top three things, but what I do see is what I consider a wrong approach to cyber. I think a lot of companies tend to do it, what I think of as almost reverse engineered. They think about technologies that they want to put in place. Hey, let's get that web filter, let's do this email filter, virus protection, and they're out there picking different things. But what they haven't really done is sort of map out and identify where the data is, where's our data going to flow through the business. And so they may not necessarily focus their cybersecurity efforts in the right place. And so, there's always this traditional expectation with cyber that you should identify the risks first. And so if I were looking at a program and somebody said top three, things that we've got in place are these three technologies, and they haven't done any sort of risk assessment, they haven't done any data flow mapping, then that would, to me, would be quite a red flag. It would mean that at any one time, they may not understand where the data is, where it's saved, how it's transmitted, which vendors are processing what vendor or what data for them in any one particular point in time. So perhaps a slightly different approach there.
I'd also say just like having a third party view on it, just like as a concept, like
Absolutely.
Just because you're head of IT or your CTO or whatever is saying one thing, like, okay, that might be right, but go get a third party view. It's not hard to do. And what's the worst thing that happens? You spend a little money and they don't find anything change, but maybe they say, hey, you got 3 or 4 blind spots here. And that, by the way, if you go get a third party view and that third party has a view into hundreds of other organizations, maybe they've seen the movie more times than you have. So they ought to be able to provide some helpful guidance.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Tina, I'll just hand back to you at this point.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Peter, as well, for today's conversation. And this also now concludes today's masterclass. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to email us. Thank you so much.